Texas, 1944. Summer heat shimmers off the flatbed trucks rolling through mesquite-dotted plains east of Austin. Inside one vehicle sits a group unlike any the American Guards have processed before. 23 German women in faded Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms, their faces gaunt from weeks of transport across the Atlantic. Among them, a 24-year-old radio operator named Liselot sits with her hands clenched in her lap, her mind racing through every propaganda broadcast she'd heard back home. The stories had been consistent and terrifying. American prisoners of war faced starvation in desert camps, forced labor in chains, humiliation designed to break their spirits. For women, the whispered rumors were even darker. The truck slows, and through the canvas flaps, she glimpses her destination. Not the steel cages and guard towers she expected, but wooden barracks surrounded by open fields. The air smells of hay and livestock, not gunpowder or despair. When the tailgate drops, a man in dusty boots and a wide-brimmed hat stands waiting. He's not dressed in the crisp military uniform she anticipated. He looks like something from the American Western films that played in Berlin before the war. A cowboy. "Ma'am," he says, his Texas drawl slow and unhurried. "Watch your step." She freezes. "Ma'am?" The guard, if that's what he is, offers his hand to help her down. She doesn't take it, expecting the courtesy to be a cruel joke. But he simply nods, steps back, and gestures toward a water station where tin cups hang from hooks. "Plenty of water there if you're thirsty. Reckon you've had a long trip." Around her, the other women descend from the trucks in cautious silence. No shouting, no rifle butts prodding them forward. Just the sound of cicadas singing in the live oak trees and a dog barking somewhere in the distance. This isn't what they were told America would be. Act 1. The propaganda and the reality for years before her capture near Cherbourg in the summer of 1944, Liselot had absorbed the Reich's carefully constructed portrait of America. The propaganda posters in Wehrmacht facilities depicted the United States as a nation of gangsters and plutocrats, a degenerate democracy where money replaced honor and cruelty passed for strength. Radio broadcasts warned that captured Germans would face torture or slavery. The stories grew darker for women. Forced labor in factories, abuse by guards, systematic humiliation. These weren't idle rumors. They were official warnings distributed through military channels. The fear was strategic. If soldiers believed capture meant death or degradation, they would fight harder rather than surrender. For the Nazi regime, American brutality had to be presented as inevitable fact. But standing in the Texas heat on that July afternoon, watching cowboys unload supply crates with casual efficiency, Liselot confronts a reality that doesn't match the narrative. The cognitive dissonance is profound. By 1944, the United States found itself managing something unprecedented in modern warfare. Over 400,000 Axis prisoners of war on American soil. The number would continue growing as Allied forces advanced through France and Italy. These weren't combat casualties to be warehoused and forgotten. They were human beings who needed to be fed, housed, and managed according to international law. The Geneva Conventions of 1929 established clear standards for POW treatment. Prisoners were entitled to housing equivalent to that of the captor nation's troops, adequate food, medical care, the right to correspond with family, and protection from humiliation or coercion. The United States, despite the massive logistical burden, chose to follow these rules with almost obsessive precision. The reasoning was threefold. First, adherence to international law protected American POWs in enemy hands by establishing reciprocal expectations. Second, well-treated prisoners required fewer guards and caused fewer disciplinary problems. Third, and perhaps most strategically, humanely treated prisoners became ambassadors of American values when they eventually returned home. Texas became a crucial component of this vast POW system for simple geographic reasons. The state offered enormous land area far from coastal invasion threats, a climate suitable for year-round outdoor work, and desperate labor shortages as young men shipped overseas. By 1944, Texas hosted over 70 major POW camps scattered from El Paso to the piney woods of East Texas. Camp Swift, located near Bastrop, east of Austin, was one of the largest. Originally constructed as a U.S. Army training facility, it sprawled across 56,000 acres of rolling hills and post oak forests. At its peak, the camp housed over 5,000 German and Italian POWs, in compounds separated by nationality and rank. Camp Hearn, north of Houston near Bryan College Station, followed similar patterns. Built rapidly in 1942, it processed thousands of German prisoners through its gates, assigning them to work details on surrounding farms and ranches. What made these Texas camps unusual wasn't their size or efficiency. It was how they managed a problem no one had anticipated: what to do with female prisoners of war. The first German women arrived in American custody in 1944 after the Normandy invasion and subsequent campaigns through France. They weren't combat soldiers but auxiliary personnel: nurses, radio operators, clerks, and support staff attached to Wehrmacht and Luftwaffe units. International law required they receive the same protections as male POWs, but housing them presented unique challenges. The solution in Texas was pragmatic. Women were separated into smaller work groups and often assigned to ranch and agricultural duties that required less physical strength than the logging or construction work assigned to male prisoners. This wasn't chivalry, it was efficiency. Texas ranchers needed help with livestock, food preparation, and general farm management. Female POWs filled those roles. For the German women arriving at these camps, the first shock came at the dinner table. The Geneva Conventions specified that POWs receive rations equivalent to those of depot troops in the captor nation's army. The U.S. Army interpreted this literally. Each prisoner received approximately 3,200 calories daily. Meat, bread, vegetables, dairy, and even coffee. To women who'd spent the final months of the war under German rationing, where meat was a luxury and bread came mixed with sawdust, the abundance seemed impossible. The first meal at Camp Swift included pot roast, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread with butter, and apple pie. Liselot stared at her plate that first evening, unable to eat. She suspected poison or some cruel test. Around her, other women whispered similar fears. It wasn't until they saw American soldiers eating identical food at adjacent tables that suspicion began cracking. "They told us we would starve," she wrote in a letter home that would be censored before delivery. "Instead, they feed us better than our own army ever did." The psychological impact of this material abundance was profound. Every meal, every clean uniform, every bar of soap in the communal showers contradicted years of propaganda. The dissonance between expectation and reality created cognitive cracks through which new understanding could emerge. But food was just the beginning. The real transformation came when the women were told they'd be working outside the wire on actual Texas ranches. Act 2. The Cowboys, the Callahan Ranch, sat 20 miles south of Camp Swift, accessible by a dirt road that wound through cedar breaks and across dry creek beds. It was a working cattle operation spanning several thousand acres, the kind of spread that had defined Texas identity since the 19th century. Frank Callahan, the ranch's third-generation owner, stood 57 years old, weathered by decades of sun and work. When Army officials approached him about using POW labor, his response was characteristically pragmatic. "If they can work and won't cause trouble, I'll take them. Can't run this place alone anymore." The Army's proposal was straightforward. German POWs would be transported to the ranch 3 times weekly, to assist with cattle operations, fence maintenance, and general ranch work. Armed guards would accompany them initially, but if behavior remained cooperative, supervision could be reduced. The prisoners would be paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip, not real currency, but credit usable in the camp canteen. For Callahan, this solved a desperate labor shortage. His 3 sons were overseas in uniform. His regular ranch hands had either enlisted or found higher-paying factory work in Houston and Dallas. The cattle still needed tending, fences still needed mending, and the work wouldn't wait for the war to end. What Frank Callahan didn't anticipate was how the arrival of 23 German women would transform his ranch into an unlikely venue for cultural reconciliation. The morning the women first arrived at the Callahan ranch in August 1944, the scene was almost comically incongruous. They descended from army trucks in their auxiliary uniforms, stiff and formal, facing a semicircle of working cowboys in dusty denim and worn leather boots. Frank stepped forward, removed his Stetson in a gesture of respect, and addressed them through an army interpreter. "Ladies, welcome to the Callahan Ranch. We've got work that needs doing, and we're grateful for the help. You'll be treated fair and fed well." "That's my word," the interpreter translated, and the women exchanged uncertain glances. One of Frank's ranch hands, a 60-something Texan named Luther, who'd been working cattle since before the First World War, leaned over and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Well, I'll be damned. German cowgirls. Never thought I'd see the day." Nervous laughter rippled through both groups. The work assignments began modestly. The women were shown to a bunkhouse that had previously housed seasonal workers, cleaned and prepared with fresh bedding. No locks on the doors, no bars on the windows. Just simple quarters with bunks, a wood-burning stove, and a table where they could eat meals prepared by the ranch cook. That first morning, they helped sort cattle for medical treatment, a process requiring patience more than strength. The longhorn cattle, massive and intimidating, needed to be guided through chutes where ranch hands could inspect them for disease or injury. Liselot found herself stationed at a gate, responsible for opening and closing it at precise moments to direct cattle flow. The work was straightforward but required attention. If she missed her timing, cattle would scatter, and the whole process would have to restart. After 2 hours, her arms ached from working the heavy wooden gate. Sweat soaked through her uniform despite the early hour. But when Luther walked past and gave her an approving nod, "You're catching on, miss," she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Pride in work. Well done. By the end of the first week, the initial awkwardness had begun dissolving into something resembling routine. The language barrier remained challenging, but work created its own vocabulary. "Point here, lift there, watch out." Simple phrases and gestures bridged the gap. What truly surprised the German women was the cowboys' teaching approach. Instead of barking orders, the ranch hands demonstrated techniques, waited for the women to attempt them, and corrected gently when mistakes occurred. When a gate slammed shut at the wrong moment, and 3 steers escaped back into the corral, Luther didn't shout or punish. He simply said, "Well, that happens. Let's go get 'em back." This measured response, treating errors as learning opportunities rather than offenses, stood in stark contrast to the rigid military hierarchy the women had experienced in the Wehrmacht. In the German military, mistakes meant reprimands, extra duties, or worse. Here, mistakes meant you tried again. 3. Learning to ride. Drahtidrids. Moment that would define the experience. For many of the German women came 3 weeks into their assignment at the Callahan Ranch. Frank announced they'd be learning to ride horses. The women assumed this was a joke. Riding horses belonged to cavalry officers and aristocrats, not prisoners of war. But Frank was serious. "Can't work cattle effectively on foot. he explained through the interpreter. Need to cover too much ground. So you'll learn to ride. That afternoon, Frank's ranch hands brought out 24 horses from the corral, already saddled and waiting. They were working ranch horses, not show animals, sturdy quarter horses and paints accustomed to novice riders. Liselot approached her assigned horse, a patient chestnut mare named Rosie, with profound skepticism mixed with fear. She'd never been closer than 50 feet to a horse in her life. The animal was enormous, standing 5 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing over 1,000 pounds. "Just talk to her gentle-like," Luther instructed. "Let her smell you. She's more scared of you than you are of her." This seemed statistically unlikely. Mounting proved to be the first challenge. The stirrup hung level with Liselotta's chest. Luther showed her how to place her left foot in the stirrup, grab the saddle horn, and swing her right leg over. It took 3 attempts, and by the 3rd try, several other women were watching and laughing, not cruelly, but with the shared relief of people discovering that everyone was equally incompetent. Once mounted, the sensation was entirely foreign. The horse shifted beneath her, and suddenly she was 8 feet off the ground, on an animal with its own opinions about where to go. "Just hold the reins gentle," Luther said, walking alongside. "When you want to go left, pull left. Right, pull right. To stop, pull back easy and say, 'Whoa.'" The theory was simple. The execution was chaos. Over the next hour, horses wandered in wrong directions, stopped to eat grass despite riders' protests, and occasionally decided to trot when walking had been requested. One horse, apparently bored with the proceedings, simply lay down, depositing its surprised rider gently onto the ground. But gradually, through patience and repetition, something began clicking. The women learned to feel the rhythm of the horse's walk, to anticipate its movements, to communicate through the reins and their own balance. By late afternoon, the entire group was riding in a loose circle around the corral, not expertly, but functionally, and for the first time since capture, they were laughing, genuinely, freely laughing. Frank watched from the fence rail, arms crossed, a slight smile on his weathered face. "Well," he said to Luther, "reckon they'll do." That evening, back in the bunkhouse, the women's mood had transformed. The fear and suspicion that had defined their first weeks had given way to something new. Curiosity about this strange country and its strange customs. "They trust us with horses," one woman said in amazement. "Horses? We could ride away. To where?" Another responded. "We're 100 miles from anywhere, in a country we don't know, speaking a language we barely understand." "Exactly," Liselot said quietly. "They know we can't escape. But more than that, I think they know we don't want to." The insight was accurate. The ranch existed in a kind of honor system. The women could have attempted escape at multiple points during their workdays, but practical reality made such attempts futile. More importantly, why would they? Here they were fed, treated with respect, and given work that felt meaningful. Running toward an uncertain fate in the Texas wilderness made less sense than staying and accepting the strange hospitality being offered. Act 4. The Erosion of Hate. See, transformation didn't happen dramatically or all at once. It accumulated through small moments that chipped away at years of conditioning. There was the afternoon when Luther taught several women to throw a lasso, demonstrating the wrist rotation needed to keep the loop open in flight. After dozens of failed attempts that ended with tangled rope and frustrated laughter, one woman, Anna, a former Wehrmacht clerk from Stuttgart, successfully roped a fence post. The cowboys erupted in cheers and applause as if she'd won an Olympic medal. There was the Sunday when Frank's wife Mary arrived at the ranch with fresh baked pies, apple, peach, and pecan, and served them to everyone, German prisoners and American ranch hands alike, making no distinction between victor and vanquished. There was the evening when Luther pulled out a harmonica and began playing Lily Marleen, the song every German soldier knew by heart. Liselot found herself singing along before she realized it, and soon other women joined, their voices carrying across the Texas prairie in the fading light. When the song ended, Luther transitioned seamlessly into Home on the Range, and somehow, despite the language barrier, the melody created a shared space where nationality mattered less than the simple human need for music. But perhaps most significantly, there was the day a thunderstorm rolled across the prairie. Texas thunderstorms don't announce themselves politely. They materialize as dark walls on the horizon and arrive with biblical fury. Lightning that turns the sky white, thunder that shakes the ground, rain so heavy, visibility drops to yards. That afternoon in September, such a storm caught the ranch unprepared. The cattle, spooked by thunder and lightning, began scattering across the pastures. If they weren't gathered quickly, they'd spread across miles of open range, taking days to recover. Frank and his hands immediately mounted up, preparing to ride out into the deluge. Then he looked at the German women, standing uncertainly under the bunkhouse eaves. "Can you ride?" he shouted over the thunder. Liselot stepped forward. "Yes, we can try," Frank nodded once. "Then mount up. We need every hand." For the next 3 hours, German prisoners and American cowboys rode together through driving rain and flashing lightning, shouting and waving to direct panicked cattle back toward the pens. The work was exhausting, occasionally dangerous, and entirely cooperative. When the last steer was penned and the storm began breaking up, the entire group stood together in the mud, soaked through, shivering, but successful. Not one animal lost. Frank walked among them, rain still dripping from his hat brim. "Couldn't have done it without you," he said simply. That night, someone, no one would admit who, hung a hand-painted sign over the bunkhouse door. "The German Cowgirls." Liselot looked at it for a long moment, then laughed until tears came. The sign would hang there for the remainder of the war. These moments accumulated into something profound. The women began to understand that America's confidence wasn't arrogance. It was the assurance of a nation that didn't need to prove its superiority through cruelty. The cowboys' easy authority, their willingness to teach rather than dominate, demonstrated a kind of power the women had never encountered. This wasn't the weakness that Nazi propaganda had described. This was strength so secure it could afford to be gentle. T5. Letters Home. In October 1944, the POWs received permission to write home. Each woman was given a single sheet of official stationery and told her letter would be censored but forwarded if it contained no sensitive information. That evening, the bunkhouse fell silent except for the scratch of pencils on paper. For months, families in Germany had known nothing of their daughters' fates beyond missing in action or prisoner of war. Now, finally, they could provide details. Liselot stared at the blank page for a long time before beginning. "Dearest Mother, I write to you from America, from a place called Texas. I am healthy and well treated. This will be difficult for you to believe, but I must tell you truthfully. The Americans are kind. We work on a ranch with cattle and horses. Yes, Mother, horses. I ride now. The food is plentiful, so plentiful I can hardly eat it all. They give us meat every day, real coffee, bread with butter. The men here are called cowboys, and they teach us to work with patience, not anger. I cannot explain how different this is from what we were told. Everything we heard about American prison camps was wrong. Or perhaps I should say, everything was a lie. I think often of home and pray you are safe. But I must also confess something. I am not suffering here. In some ways, I am freer than I have ever been. Your daughter, Liselot." The letters were collected the next morning. 6 weeks later, replies arrived, carefully censored, trembling with disbelief. "Liselot, Are you certain you write the truth? We have heard such terrible things about American camps. Your father says you must be forced to write these lies. But I want to believe you. I want to believe that somewhere in this terrible war, there is still kindness. Please write again and tell me more. The disconnect between propaganda and reality created profound cognitive dissonance for families back home. German civilians were enduring round-the-clock bombing, food shortages, and the steady collapse of civil order. The idea that their captured daughters were riding horses and eating apple pie in Texas seemed like delusion or fantasy. But it wasn't fantasy. It was the result of a calculated American strategy. Prove through actions that democracy's promises about human dignity weren't just propaganda. Other women received similar skeptical replies. Some families refused to believe the accounts at all, insisting the letters were fake or coerced. Others wrote back begging for more details, hungry for any evidence that the world wasn't entirely consumed by hatred. The women continued writing monthly. Over time, the letters began documenting not just physical conditions, but emotional transformation. They wrote about learning English phrases from the cowboys, about celebrating American Thanksgiving in November with turkey and cranberry sauce, about Christmas 1944, when the ranch hands cut a cedar tree, decorated it with homemade ornaments, and gave each woman a small gift: scarves, writing paper, bars of chocolate. They treat us not as enemies, one woman wrote, but as people who happen to be on the wrong side. This distinction was crucial. The cowboys didn't hate Germans as a category. They simply opposed Nazi aggression. Once the prisoners were disarmed and no longer threats, they could be treated as individual human beings rather than ideological enemies. For women raised under totalitarianism, where individual identity was subsumed into collective national purpose, this American individualism was revolutionary. April 1945. The wind across the Texas plains carried the smell of wildflowers and fresh rain. Calves had been born, fields were greening, and the rhythm of ranch work had become familiar to the German women who now measured time not in military operations, but in seasons of cattle management. Then the radio in Frank Callahan's kitchen, usually reserved for weather reports and livestock prices, began carrying news that changed everything. Soviet forces had entered Berlin. Hitler was reported dead. German forces were surrendering across Europe. The war was ending. That afternoon, Frank walked out to the corral where several women were repairing fence line. His face was solemn, his hat in his hand. Luther stood beside him, equally quiet. "Ladies," Frank said, waiting for the interpreter, "I need to tell you something. Germany has surrendered. The war is over." The words hung in the hot afternoon air like something physical. Liselot set down the wire cutters she'd been holding. Around her, other women stopped working, frozen in place. Over. After 6 years of war that had consumed Europe, after millions of deaths, after entire cities reduced to rubble, after everything they'd known and everyone they'd loved had been fed into the furnace of total war, it was over. Anna began crying softly. Others stood in stunned silence. One woman, barely 19 years old, whispered, "What happens to us now?" It was the question none of them had allowed themselves to ask during the months of ranch work and gradual adaptation to captivity. As long as the war continued, they existed in a kind of suspended animation, neither truly prisoners nor truly free. But now the war had ended, and their futures became uncertain once again. Frank gestured toward the ranch house. "Come on in, we'll put coffee on and figure this out together." That evening, the bunkhouse felt different. The women gathered, speaking in low voices, trying to process what peace meant. For months, they'd received carefully censored letters from home describing bombing raids, food shortages, and the steady destruction of German cities. Now that destruction was complete. Germany existed, but what kind of Germany? Their hometowns might be gone. Their families might be dead. The nation that had sent them to war no longer existed in any recognizable form. What will we go back to? Liselot asked no one in particular. The question had no easy answer. Over the following days, Army officials arrived at the ranch to begin processing the women for eventual repatriation. The war might be over, but the logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic required time and coordination. Germany's infrastructure was shattered. Its ports were damaged or destroyed. Transportation had collapsed. The women would need to wait, perhaps months, before ships could be arranged for their return voyage. In the meantime, they continued working at the Callahan ranch. The cattle still needed tending. The fences still needed mending. And, in an odd way, the familiar routine provided comfort in the face of tremendous uncertainty. Frank addressed them one morning in early May. "I know you'll be heading home eventually, but until that day comes, you're welcome to stay and work, if you want to. We'll keep paying you, keep feeding you, keep treating you fair." That hasn't changed just because the war ended. It was a small gesture, but its significance was profound. The war that had defined their roles as prisoner and captor had concluded, yet the human relationships that had developed continued. The women weren't being discarded or suddenly treated as burdens now that their labor was no longer technically necessary. They remained valued members of the ranch community until circumstances changed. This continuity mattered deeply to women who faced the terrifying prospect of returning to a homeland that existed only in ruins and memory. ACT 497. Gifts and goodbyes, the Yom. Repatriation orders finally arrived in September 1945. The women would be transported back to Camp Swift for processing, then moved to East Coast ports, where troop ships were being converted to carry returning POWs across the Atlantic. The morning the Army trucks arrived to collect them, the Callahan Ranch gathered for an informal farewell. It wasn't an official ceremony, just ranch hands, cowboys, and the German women who'd worked alongside them for over a year. Standing together in the early morning light, Mary Callahan had baked pies. Apple, peach, and pecan, the same flavors she'd served at countless Sunday dinners that had included these unlikely guests. She served them one final time, using her good china plates, treating the moment with the dignity it deserved. Frank stood before the group, turning his hat in his hands in the way he did when he had something important to say. "Well," he began, his Texas drawl softer than usual, "reckon this is goodbye. You all came here as prisoners. Don't know what you expected to find, but I hope it wasn't too terrible." Nervous laughter rippled through the women. "You worked hard," Frank continued, "earned your keep and then some. And I want you to know something important. When you go home and tell folks about America, you tell them the truth. Tell them we're not the monsters you were warned about. We're just people trying to do right by each other, same as anywhere else." He paused, then reached behind him where Luther was holding a wooden crate. From it, Frank pulled out 23 Stetson hats, cream-colored, well-made, the kind that cost real money in wartime Texas. "These are for you," he said, "so you don't forget Texas." One by one, he placed a hat on each woman's head, adjusting the brims, treating the moment with ceremonial solemnity. When he reached Liselot, he settled the Stetson on her head with particular care. "You were the first to really trust us," he said quietly. "That took courage." Liselot couldn't speak. She simply nodded, tears streaming down her face. Luther stepped forward with his harmonica. Without preamble, he began playing "Home on the Range." The melody drifted across the prairie, carrying with it all the strange contradictions of the past year. Prisoners and captors become friends. Enemies become colleagues. Hatred dissolved through the simple act of shared work under wide Texas skies. When the song ended, the women boarded the trucks. As they drove away, they looked back through the wooden slats at the ranch disappearing into the distance. The barns, the windmill, the corral, and the small group of men waving their hats in farewell. Liselot clutched her Stetson in her lap, her mind already turning toward the uncertain future. She whispered to herself, more prayer than statement, maybe we lost the war, but perhaps we can still win peace. Acquis 8. Return to ruins. The journey home took 3 months. The Atlantic crossing was slow, the ships overcrowded with returning POWs of all nationalities. When the transport carrying Liselot and her companions finally reached Bremerhaven in December 1945, what greeted them was devastation beyond anything propaganda or censored letters had prepared them for. The port was rubble. The city beyond was flattened. What had once been streets were now rivers of broken concrete and twisted steel. The famous cathedral stood roofless, its walls scorched black. Everywhere, the smell of smoke and decay hung in the cold air. As the women disembarked, American military police directed them toward processing centers where they would receive identity papers, ration cards, and instructions on where to report for further assistance. The efficiency was familiar. The same organizational competence they'd observed in Texas, now managing the occupation of a shattered nation. Before they left the dock, Red Cross workers distributed care packages, canned food, chocolate, soap, and clothing. Each package bore the unmistakable stamp of American logistics. The women accepted them with a mixture of gratitude and profound irony. Even in defeat, even after all the destruction, America continued feeding its former enemies. Liselot's journey to her hometown near Stuttgart took 5 days. She traveled by military truck, by commandeered bus, and finally on foot through roads so damaged that wheeled vehicles couldn't pass. When she finally reached the village where she'd been born and raised, she found it barely recognizable. Her family home was gone, not damaged, but simply erased by bombing. Her parents had died in an air raid 2 years earlier, information that had never reached her in Texas. Her younger brother was listed as missing on the Eastern Front, almost certainly dead. The village's population had been cut in half by war casualties, deportation, and flight from advancing Soviet forces. She stood in the ruins of what had been her street, clutching her canvas bag that contained everything she owned. 2 changes of clothes, letters from home, and a cream-colored Stetson hat that looked impossibly out of place in this landscape of destruction. Neighbor she barely recognized approached, an old woman who'd aged decades in the 6 years since Liselot had last seen her. "You survived," the woman said, her voice hollow with exhaustion. "Yes," Liselot replied. "I was a prisoner in America." The woman's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "And they let you live?" "They did more than that," Liselot said quietly. "They treated us with dignity." The woman shook her head, unwilling or unable to believe. She walked away without another word. This response would become familiar over the following months. When Liselot and other returning POWs tried to share their experiences in American captivity, they encountered profound skepticism. To Germans who had endured years of bombing, starvation, and brutal fighting, stories of Texas ranches and cowboy hospitality sounded like delusions or propaganda. How could the same nation that had firebombed Dresden have treated prisoners so well? The cognitive dissonance was too great for many to accept. But slowly, as more POWs returned and shared similar accounts, the truth began spreading. American captivity had been, if not pleasant, at least humane. Prisoners had been fed adequately, treated according to international law, and allowed to maintain dignity. For many Germans, this revelation prompted profound questions about everything they'd been taught during the Nazi era. Liselot found work as an interpreter for American occupation forces. Her English, learned from Texas cowboys and filled with colorful idioms, often drew smiles from the officers she worked with. "Where'd you learn to speak English?" one captain asked. "On a cattle ranch in Texas," she replied. The captain laughed, thinking it was a joke. When she insisted it was true, He asked her to tell the whole story. She did, and the captain sat listening in amazement. "That's the America we're supposed to be showing people," he said when she finished. "The real America. Not the bombers and soldiers, but the ordinary folks doing right by each other." He asked if she'd be willing to speak at a conference on post-war reconstruction scheduled for Stuttgart the following month. She agreed. Act 9. Speaking Truth. Cetoise. The conference hall in Stuttgart, one of the few buildings left partially intact, held perhaps 200 people, a mix of German civilians, American occupation officials, British observers, and French military administrators. The topic was reconciliation and rebuilding, abstract concepts in a world still smoking from total war. When Liselot took the podium, wearing her Stetson hat in a gesture both defiant and celebratory, a murmur ran through the crowd. She looked impossibly young, 25 years old, wearing a dress sewn from parachute silk by a neighbor who'd learned to remake everything from salvaged materials. She began simply, "I was a prisoner of war in Texas." The hall quieted. "I expected to be treated terribly. We all did. We had been told that Americans were savages, that captured Germans would be starved or worse. I believed these things because I had been taught them all my life." She paused, letting the admission settle. "I was wrong. America showed me something I had never known existed. A nation confident enough in its values that it didn't need to crush its enemies to prove its strength." She described the Callahan ranch, the cowboys who taught her to ride, the meals shared around the fire, the trust extended to prisoners who could have escaped but chose to stay. She spoke of Frank Callahan giving them Stetsons as farewell gifts, of Mary's pies, of Luther's harmonica playing Lily Marlene under Texas stars. "They could have treated us cruelly," she said. "We had been their enemies. We had fought against them. They had every justification for hatred. But they chose dignity instead. They chose to see us not as Germans or enemies, but as human beings." Her voice grew stronger as she continued. "If we want to rebuild Germany, we must learn this lesson. Strength does not come from domination. True power is the ability to treat even your enemies with respect. This is what democracy means. Not weak government or moral relativism, but the conviction that every person possesses inherent worth." When she finished, the hall was silent. Then an elderly German woman in the front row stood and began clapping. Others joined, and soon the entire hall was applauding. Not for Germany or America, but for the simple truth that human decency could survive even total war. After the speech, dozens of people approached Liselot with questions. Some were skeptical, still unable to believe Americans could have been so generous. Others were former POWs themselves, nodding in recognition as she described experiences similar to their own. One man, a Wehrmacht veteran who'd been captured in North Africa and spent 2 years at a POW camp in Kansas, told her, "I came home ashamed we lost the war. But after seeing what we had become under Hitler, I realized losing was perhaps the only way we could be saved from ourselves. The Americans didn't just defeat us, they showed us a better way to live." These conversations, repeated thousands of times across Germany in 1946 and 1947, played a quiet but vital role in Reconstruction. The POWs who returned with stories of decent treatment became unofficial ambassadors of American values, making the difficult work of building democratic institutions more palatable to a defeated population. EC 10. Coming home by 1948. Liselot had saved enough money from her interpreter work to consider her future. Germany was slowly rebuilding, but the process would take decades. She thought often of Texas, the wide skies, the straightforward honesty of the cowboys, the sense of possibility that permeated even routine ranch work. That spring, she applied for immigration to the United States through a program that allowed former POWs with clean records and valuable skills to petition for visas. Her application cited her interpreter experience and her willingness to work in any capacity. 8 months later, her visa was approved. When the ship carrying her toward America passed the Statue of Liberty in February 1949, Liselot stood on deck in the cold wind, her Stetson hat firmly on her head despite 4 years of wear. Other passengers stared at the strange sight. A young German woman wearing a cowboy hat, tears streaming down her face. "You going to Texas?" another German immigrant asked in accented English. "Yes," Liselot replied. "I'm going home." She settled in San Antonio, not far from where she'd worked during the war. Using a small loan from the Veterans Administration, available even to former enemy POWs, under certain circumstances, she opened a bakery in a storefront near the Alamo. The bakery specialized in a curious fusion: German pastries made with Texas ingredients and American techniques, apple strudel with Texas pecans, pretzels dusted with smoked salt from hill country meat markets, Black Forest cake made with bourbon instead of kirsch. The combinations were unconventional, but they worked. Above the counter, she hung a framed photograph, a young woman in 1945 wearing a cowboy hat too large for her head, standing next to a tall rancher with a gentle smile. Beneath it, a simple inscription read, "From enemies to friends." Regular customers learned to recognize the photo's significance. When they asked about it, Liselot would tell the story, sometimes briefly, sometimes at length, depending on how busy the bakery was. She never tired of telling it because the story contained a truth she believed people needed to hear. Reconciliation is possible. Even after the worst human conflicts over the years, other former POWs found their way to her bakery. Some had settled in Texas permanently. Others were visiting from Germany and had heard about the remarkable German woman who'd stayed in America. They would sit at her tables, drinking coffee and trading memories of a time when enemies learned to be neighbors. One afternoon in 1953, the bell above the bakery door rang, and Frank Callahan walked in. He was older, more stooped, his face even more weathered by time and sun. But his smile was the same. "Heard you were here," he said simply. "Thought I'd check on you." Liselot came from behind the counter and embraced him, proprietor hugging customer in a way that defied all German customs of formality. "Mr. Callahan," she said, laughter mixing with tears, "I've been waiting for you." They sat for 3 hours, drinking coffee and eating apple strudel, talking about the ranch, about the women who'd worked there, about what had become of everyone. Luther had died 2 years earlier, Frank reported, but peacefully in his sleep. The ranch was doing well. His sons had returned from war and were learning the business. "Do you ever regret staying in America?" Frank asked. Liselot looked around her bakery, at the customers, at the photograph on the wall, at the life she'd built from the ruins of war. "Never," she said. "This is where I learned what freedom really means. Not the political kind, but the personal kind. The freedom to be treated with dignity, regardless of where you were born or what flag you once served." Frank nodded. "That's Texas," he said. "That's America at its best." Seat 11. Legacy Liselot's bakery remained open until 1982, when she retired at age 62. By then, it had become a San Antonio institution, known not just for its pastries, but for the story it represented. The German women who'd worked at the Callahan Ranch scattered across the world after the war. Some returned to Germany and rebuilt their lives amid the ruins. Others, like Liselot, immigrated to America. A few married American soldiers they met during the occupation years. They corresponded regularly, maintaining bonds formed through shared captivity and shared transformation. In 1975, several of them organized a reunion in San Antonio. 11 women, now in their 50s, gathered at Liselot's bakery to remember their time as German cowgirls. They wore the Stetson hats Frank had given them 3 decades earlier, battered, faded, but carefully preserved. Local newspapers covered the reunion, and the story caught national attention. For many Americans in 1975, a decade removed from Vietnam and grappling with questions about American power and morality, these elderly women offered a reminder of a time when American values had been demonstrated through actions rather than rhetoric. A television documentary crew came to San Antonio, interviewing the women about their experiences. One segment showed them visiting the Callahan Ranch, now operated by Frank's grandson. The barns were different, the equipment modernized, but the land remained the same. Those wide Texas plains stretching to the horizon. Standing in the corral where they'd first learned to ride, the women wept openly, not from sadness, but from gratitude that they'd survived to see this moment, that history had given them both the horror of war and the grace of reconciliation. The documentary aired on PBS in 1976, during America's bicentennial year. It struck a chord with viewers tired of cynicism and division. Here was concrete evidence that American ideals, dignity, fairness, and respect even for enemies, could produce real results when actually practiced. Historians began examining the broader pattern that these women's experiences represented. Between 1942 and 1946, the United States had held over 400,000 Axis POWs on American soil. The vast majority reported treatment that met or exceeded Geneva Convention standards. Many, like Liselot, returned to their home countries as informal ambassadors of American values. This mass exposure to American society, to its prosperity, its legal principles, its casual egalitarianism, played a documented role in shaping post-war attitudes, particularly in Germany. Former POWs became more likely to support democratic reforms, to question authoritarian leadership, and to believe in the possibility of peaceful international relations. The Texas ranch programs represented this approach at its most effective, by trusting prisoners with meaningful work, by treating them as capable adults rather than dangerous enemies, by demonstrating American confidence through generosity rather than domination. Ranchers like Frank Callahan conducted psychological warfare of the most subtle and effective kind. When Liselot died in 1987, her obituary appeared in newspapers across Texas and in several major German publications. She was remembered not just as a businesswoman or immigrant, but as a living bridge between two nations that had once tried to destroy each other. Her funeral at San Antonio's Travis Park United Methodist Church drew over 200 people. Among them were 3 surviving members of the original group of German cowgirls, elderly women who'd traveled from Germany to say goodbye to their friend. The service included both Amazing Grace and Lily Marlene, the song that had connected enemies across cultural divides in 1944. As the last notes faded, Frank Callahan's grandson stood to speak. He'd never met Liselot during the war years. He'd been born long after, but he'd grown up hearing stories about the German women who'd worked on his family's ranch. My grandfather used to say that winning the war was necessary, but winning the peace was harder, he began. He said the peace wasn't won in Washington or at conferences. It was won in small moments of decency, when people chose to see each other's humanity instead of each other's. Flags. He held up a photograph, the same one that had hung in Liselot's bakery for 38 years. This picture represents something America needs to remember. Our strength doesn't come from crushing our enemies. It comes from being confident enough in our values that we can treat even our enemies with dignity. The congregation rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Epilogue. The lesson today. The Callahan Ranch still operates in central Texas, though the family sold it in the 1990s. The new owners discovered the bunkhouse where German POWs had lived and converted it into a museum documenting that unusual chapter of ranch history. The hand-painted sign reading, "The German Cowgirls," hangs preserved under glass. Visitors can see photographs of the women learning to ride, working cattle, sitting around evening fires. They can read excerpts from letters sent home describing the bewildering generosity of capture. They can watch video interviews with the few surviving participants, now very elderly, remembering with clarity the day they learned that their enemies could also be their friends. The museum includes a section on the broader POW experience in Texas and across America during World War II. Over 650 POW camps operated in 46 states. Thousands of prisoners worked on farms, in forests, and in factories, filling labor shortages while American men fought overseas. The program was controversial at the time. Some Americans objected to coddling the enemy while their own sons died in combat. But the long-term results vindicated the approach. Former POWs became some of post-war Germany's strongest advocates for democracy and alliance with the West. They'd seen American prosperity firsthand. They'd experienced American fairness. They'd learned that the propaganda about degenerate democracy had been lies designed to prop up dictatorship. The story of Liselot and the German Cowgirls represents this transformation in microcosm. They arrived expecting monsters and found human beings. They came as prisoners and left as witnesses to the proposition that even in total war, decency remains possible if people choose it. This lesson matters beyond historical interest. In every generation, wars create enemies. In every conflict, propaganda portrays the other side as less than human. The Texas ranch experience demonstrates that this dehumanization isn't inevitable. It's a choice. America in 1944 could have treated its prisoners cruelly. It had justification. German submarines had sunk American ships. German bombs had killed Allied civilians. The full horror of the Holocaust was being discovered. Every reason existed to respond with hatred. Instead, American policymakers decided that demonstrating democratic values would serve national interests better than revenge. They fed prisoners well, paid them fairly, protected their rights, and trusted them with meaningful work. This wasn't weakness disguised as mercy. It was strength so secure it could afford to be generous. The German women who learned to ride horses on Texas ranches carried this lesson back to a devastated homeland. Through thousands of conversations, speeches, and quiet examples, they helped reshape German attitudes about democracy, about America, and about the possibility of building something better from wars. Ruins. Liselot's bakery in San Antonio became a physical manifestation of this transformation, a place where German traditions and American ingredients mixed to create something new, where enemies could become neighbors, where the past informed but didn't imprison the future. When she died, she left behind not just recipes and memories, but a principle. Reconciliation begins not with treaties between governments, but with acts of dignity between individuals. A cowboy offering water to a prisoner. A rancher teaching an enemy to ride. A simple decision to treat captured Germans not as monsters to be caged, but as people who'd made the mistake of serving a monstrous cause. This distinction between hating the ideology and respecting the individual represents America at its most powerful. Not the America of tanks and bombers, but the America of wide open spaces and second chances. The America that believed so deeply in its own values that it could extend them even to those who'd tried to destroy it. 79 years after the war ended, the lessons remain relevant. In a world still divided by conflict and suspicion, the story of German cowgirls in Texas offers proof that former enemies can build genuine friendship, that dignity extended creates dignity returned, and that sometimes the greatest victories are won not through force, but through the simple revolutionary act of treating other human beings with respect. The photograph still hangs in the Callahan Ranch Museum. A young woman in a too large Stetson, standing beside a tall rancher, both smiling despite everything that had brought them together. Beneath it, the inscription reads, "From enemies to friends." It's a short sentence, But it contains the entire story of war and reconciliation, of fear transformed into trust, of the moment when prisoners stopped being prisoners and became instead partners in building something better than what had been destroyed. That moment happened not in Congress or at Versailles, but on a Texas ranch where cowboys taught German women to ride horses instead of keeping them in chains. And in doing so, they demonstrated a truth worth remembering. America is never stronger than when it's confident enough in its own values to extend them to everyone, even those who were once its enemies.